Welcome to this explainer. We're diving into something super fascinating today, taking a totally analytical, almost clinical look at a highly emotional topic, human relationships. Think of this as a strategic briefing for relationship analysts, or really anyone curious about the raw mechanics of why we bond and why we inevitably drift apart. We're going to decode the biological and psychological systems that drive relationship instability using a very specific evolutionary and philosophical framework to see if we can actually, override our deepest programming. Let's get right into it.
So, picture this. You've hit the 7-year mark and suddenly things start falling apart. Why does this happen to so many couples? We usually look at the 7-year itch as this huge moral failure, right? Like, oh, they just didn't try hard enough. Or we frame it as this tragic loss of true love. But what if we completely strip the emotion out of it? What if we look at this not as a tragedy, but literally just as a biological algorithm running its course? That's exactly the premise we're unpacking today. Here's our roadmap. We'll start with the evolutionary mating program, then map out the pair constellation matrix. After that, we'll dive into developing the Überfrau partnership, explore Amor Fati as a literal system hack, and wrap it all up with a practical checklist for relationship strategists to take home.
Okay, part 1, the evolutionary mating program. Let's decode this biological algorithm.
Over millions of years, our ancestors developed a 4-phase cycle. According to our source model, this whole thing kicks off with the alpha phase. The focus here? Strictly seeking the best genetics and dominance. But once fertilization happens, boom, the algorithm shifts drastically. We enter the provider phase. Suddenly, security and resources are the absolute top priority. But then, usually around year 7, we hit the rejection phase. That biological drive to keep that specific provider close, it drops off. Sexual attraction plummets, and this deep, nagging dissatisfaction sets in. Finally, the system hits restart, and the cycle repeats. It's a massive transition from seeking genetics to seeking security, straight into a programmed system reset.
Now here is absolutely crucial context. This program isn't good or bad. Evolution doesn't have a moral compass. It just blindly experiments. This cycle was incredibly successful for early human survival in a super harsh environment. But, and here's the fascinating contrast from our sources, what kept us alive back then causes massive friction in modern, long-term monogamy. Think about it. Today, we have the incredible ability to consciously design our lives, right? We can define our values, plan long-term, and build these complex partnerships. Yet, we are constantly colliding with these blind, ancient scripts running quietly in the background.
Moving on to part 2, the pair constellation matrix. Let's analyze the actual success rates of these different relationship variables.
When we look at the system data, a super clear picture emerges for relationship strategists. Let's say an Überman, basically a man who is highly conscious of his programming, pairs up with a non-Überfrau. That can work mid-term, but man, it requires immense strategic energy from him. He has to manage his own instincts while constantly balancing out her unconscious dynamics. Now flip it, an Überfrau with a non-Überman, the sources show this rarely works long-term. Her inevitable biological dissatisfaction will eventually override the dynamic because he can't manage the process on a meta level. The absolute ideal? The union of an Überman and an Überfrau, two highly conscious individuals actively steering their instincts. This offers by far the deepest stability because both partners actually understand the system and consciously shape it.
But let's be real. The most common scenario is the default collision. Systemic analysis is pretty ruthless here. When two people run purely on their biological default settings, as a non-Überman and non-Überfrau, instability is practically hardwired. There's no malicious intent here. It's literally just the combination of unconscious biological programming meeting opportunity, which almost inevitably leads to separation. It's a mechanical process that just runs its course if nobody's at the steering wheel.
Which brings us to part 3, developing the Überfrau partnership, moving from biological determinism to conscious control.
Just to be crystal clear, this concept, which draws heavily from Nietzsche's philosophy, is absolutely not about losing your femininity or masculinity. Not at all. It's about achieving absolute metacognitive control over your instincts. Let's play out a concrete scenario. Imagine a woman in a 7-year marriage. Suddenly, she feels a massive drop in attraction to her husband, along with this vague, nagging dissatisfaction. A non-Überfrau might interpret this internal monologue as, oh, I don't love him anymore, we've grown apart, and basically file for divorce. But the Überfrau, she sees right through it. She observes her feelings and thinks, ah, there it is, the hormonal echo of the rejection phase. My algorithm is just trying to force a restart. She feels the feeling, but she consciously overrides it. She actively chooses to invest in the long-term stability of her family and her chosen polarity rather than just blindly following a temporary biological impulse.
And that right there is the stark difference between passive reaction and active steering. The biological default is completely blind and reactive. You're literally being driven by unconscious hormonal cycles and temporary dissatisfaction. Metacognitive control, on the other hand, is active steering. It's this incredibly freeing realization: just because I feel a strong impulse doesn't mean it actually serves my modern strategic life goals. We get to decide. Do we hand the steering wheel over to our biology, or do we determine the direction ourselves?
So how do we actually do this? Part 4. Amor Fati as a system hack. Let's talk about neutralizing dissatisfaction in complex systems.
Amor Fati basically translates to love of fate. Human relationships are highly complex, recursive systems. Every action influences the next, often in completely unpredictable ways. In this context, Amor Fati means that we dance with the tension of this system instead of fighting the inevitable challenges. This is exactly how you overcome relationship instability. Instead of resisting the friction that naturally happens when two people intertwine their lives, you accept it radically, even joyfully. You acknowledge the unpredictability as a built-in, integral feature of the complex system you consciously chose.
By reframing negative emotions as purely mechanical sensors in a feedback loop, we strip away their destructive emotional weight. If you view sudden relationship dissatisfaction not as the tragic end of your love story, but simply as a warning light on your dashboard, a sensor reacting to specific biological or environmental triggers, you stop that emotion from destroying the partnership. You notice the sensor, read the data, and then totally calmly and rationally decide how to recalibrate the system. You fix the engine, you don't set the whole car on fire.
Part 5. The checklist for relationship strategists. Let's look at some practical tools to actually override those evolutionary defaults.
This checklist gives us the exact metacognitive tools we need. First, embrace truth as a foundation. Don't tie your ego to being right in an argument. Focus on finding the actual truth of the dynamic. Second, use temporary absolute truth. Hold your current relationship boundaries and strategies with total conviction, but be ready to adapt them instantly if new data shows your approach is failing. Third, practice radical self-doubt. Constantly ask yourself, where might I be completely deceiving myself about my own biases? Fourth, reframe dissatisfaction. Treat relationship friction as a system sensor, not an emotional absolute. And fifth, maybe the most important, guard against inverse metacognition. The sources define this as the dangerous illusion of being a totally independent critical thinker. The second you think, I know all about evolutionary psychology, my relationship is immune, your metacognition shuts off, and your biological impulses sneak right back into the driver's seat.
To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought. The ultimate goal isn't to perfectly defeat your biology once and for all. It's to permanently question it. Strong opinions loosely held. Is the dissatisfaction you might be feeling today actually based on your partner's actions, or are you just running a million-year-old script? Are you actually steering your relationship, or is your evolutionary programming steering you? Thanks for joining today's analysis, and never stop questioning the default.